welcome to the stage Adrian Goodhead, Security Specialist at Saudi Aramco.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Well, firstly, thank you very much to the organizers of this presentation, and also thank you to this hotel, which is an excellent place to stay. But I'd also like to say thank you to OWASP, all the volunteers at OWASP who make these speeches possible and do a lot of work in the background and are the unsung heroes of these projects. I'll introduce myself. My name is Adrian Goodhead. I'm currently a security specialist working in the application security area at Saudi Aramco. I've been in the IT security profession for over 20 years. I've done some amazing things, but I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here to talk about security. Very important is, of course, keeping in mind that security is a journey, not a destination. Often we get approached by management to say, are we secure yet? And this is not a question we can answer on a day-to-day basis. Security is all about constant improvement. So when we talk about improvement, we look to the Japanese philosophy of Kaizen. And Kaizen is all about continuous improvement. And that is what security is all about. And that is exactly what security standards are also about. We're looking to continually improve the quality of our applications. We're looking to work with developers to ensure that the applications are built correctly. And in the long term, this will provide sustainable security that we can rely on in our critical applications and infrastructure. So firstly, what we want to do is we want to drive security improvements across the organization. So this is very key. We want to continually improve the situation and the number of controls that are implemented. Our standards are based on OWASP. I've been working with the OWASP chapters for over a decade. And we use them as the basis for our application standards. And also NIST. We live by NIST guidelines, such as the Cybersecurity framework, but also the NIST has very valuable regulations and standards around the mobile applications, good governance practices. As I mentioned, the Cybersecurity framework is key in the building of our standards. You need to ensure that your application standards are customized for your environment. For example, you may be a very SAP-heavy shop, or you may be using a lot of Oracle-based applications or REST applications. So you need to ensure that your standards are applicable to your business and your organization. And the end objective is always to improve compliance levels in a sustainable manner. We want to see continuous improvement, and we want to monitor that through the standards. At Saudi Aramco, we've been following a 2-year program to review the application baselines for over 300 applications. And because of the size of our security program, we've got some valuable lessons which I want to share with you in my presentation. And these are some of the things that we've realized, but also dependencies and things you need to consider when building standards, not just application standards. This applies to any program, a long-term program of work. So again, we need to improve security in a sustainable manner. I'm going to repeat that because this is what it's all about. We need to be looking at, are our initiatives actually improving the level of security controls to remove things from the OWASP top 10? So for me, a very critical success factor is the integrating into the app development lifecycle. One of our previous presenters talked about threat modeling, and this is a very key way of doing this. We need to have regular updates for new technologies. If we're deploying new applications with new frameworks, we need to ensure that we are updating our standards accordingly. Our standards are a dynamic, living, breathing organism, and these need to constantly improve. If your standard was last updated a year ago, you probably have 5 or 10 technologies that have no baseline or no standards guidance within your organization. We want to prioritize applications. So in other words, we want to have a criticality rating for your applications. We need to look and focus on those most critical applications. If we don't spend our effort in the right place, we could implement controls that are not appropriate for the level of security required. We need to be using innovative application discovery solutions. I think application discovery is a very critical area for application security. Having a strong inventory ensures that you know what is in your estate. It allows you to make decisions, real risk-based decisions, and to understand the applications that you have in your environment. There are some new initiatives out there to use machine learning and other technologies to identify applications in your estate, because at the end of the day, you can't secure what you don't know. So you now have to understand what applications exist within your organization. You need to be using a risk assessment model that accounts for cumulative risk. And what this means in simple terms is, if you have 2 low risks or 5 low risks, can these result in a medium risk in your organization? We see this all the time with attackers, where an attacker will leverage a number of low-risk vulnerabilities, and he'll chain them together in a creative way, and this results in a medium or high-risk vulnerability. You know, often we prioritize high and medium risk, but at the same time we have to understand the cumulative risk. So when you're building your risk assessment models, you need to keep this in mind. You also have to manage the exception management process carefully, because sometimes standards cannot be fixed, application controls cannot be implemented. And in cases like this, then you need to ensure that these are managed and are documented. System documentation is critical. And also managing third-party components is a fundamental of any application security program. And we'll talk about this in more detail. So we spend a lot of time working with our developers, and this involves developer training. It involves breaking down those barriers between the different IT departments. I think traditionally large companies have worked in silos, and now we're in a position where we're using the DevSecOps initiative to break down those barriers and merge our processes together, so that when we run security scans, it's actually done by our developers. When we find vulnerabilities, often it's found by our developers, not by our pen testers. This is resulting in a significant reduction in vulnerabilities within our organization. And this also entails deep integration of security into the development processes, and also continuous delivery. With a modern application development lifecycle and SDL, we have to ensure that we are able to respond dynamically to any security changes, as well as changes to the applications themselves. So I'll talk about this one over and over in this presentation. The fundamentals of merging those processes together and ensuring a delivery pipeline that is continuous and is effective. It's a cornerstone of modern application development. We have to be in a continuous improvement cycle with our documents. So we need to ensure that there's new technologies are included in our standards, they're updated, best practice material is referenced and used. And also, our best standard is based on our worst incident. So of course, you have to develop your standards in line with the vulnerabilities that you find on your system. And as always, we have stakeholder engagement is vital in what we do. So you need to involve all of the business units to ensure that these standards are accepted across the organization and other business units. Of course, budget is limited in some cases in security program, and of course so is time and resources. So we need to break down the barriers between security and dev, and this results in a similar and significant reduction in the number of vulnerabilities in production systems. We also need deep integration with the processes, as I mentioned previously. Another key aspect is streamlining of the code deployment pipeline. And as I mentioned, this is all about being able to deliver code faster in the DevSecOps environment, ensuring that we have security fixes in a timelier way, and ensuring that overall the application security controls are being implemented as soon as possible. Well, this is a very hot potato for a lot of organizations. It's an asymmetrical information problem. You can't secure what you don't know about. How many times does an organization get compromised by an application sitting in the corner of their web form that no one's ever heard of? And unfortunately, this is what happens. We have to ensure that we understand which applications are out there. If we're able to do this, we're in a much better position to apply security controls to them. So you need to ensure that your change management processes are very effective, and that there's security involvement in change management. You need to have a single repository for application inventory. This is in order to be able to reference when changes are made. When a new application is introduced to your estate, how do you ensure that your security teams become aware of it? If an application is introduced in isolation, it may be vulnerable to attack. And of course, the good old RACI matrix comes into play. We need very well-defined roles and responsibilities. This will help us ensure that the right people are doing the right actions relating to the standards and the compliance against them. We always need to be ensuring that we have a risk assessment model that is realistic. So whenever we're building risk management frameworks, we need to ensure that they're weighted per domain in OWASP. Because if we look at the OWASP presentations that we see, the different domains have a different risk levels. I think the domains for authentication, authorization, and input validation, for example, those have a much higher weighting and a much bigger risk to the organizations than some of the other sections, for example, like logging. So we need to ensure that these weightings are accurate and make sense for our organization. And of course, a lot of my work is involved with technical validation. So what I do is I perform penetration testing against applications to validate whether these controls have been implemented by the proponents. And what this means is we get a chance to understand the real technical risk. When a theoretical risk exists, that does not mean that your system is vulnerable. So we have to look at the gap between compliance and the reality of how secure your system may be. And this allows us to evaluate the effectiveness of our mitigating controls as well. A lot of the time, compensating or mitigating controls are implemented as part of risk management. And what we see is, how do you gauge the effectiveness of these controls? How do you ensure that these controls are actually reducing the likelihood of a security incident? Well, I apologize for repeating myself, but this is an issue close to my heart. We have to break down the barriers between IT processes. We need to integrate our processes between operational entities, such as IT departments managing systems, between security and our developers. Their processes need to interact in a way that allows for security to be implemented at a very early stage in the development lifecycle or SDL. And of course, as I mentioned, these are very important factors. We have to ensure that we have a streamlined code delivery mechanism. Be that team foundation server, we need to talk about code transport. So when we're developing applications, how do we ensure that the actual version of code that's been tested is the same as the version in production? So this is a fundamental requirement. How do you ensure this happens? Well, everybody enjoys change management as much as I do. I spend a lot of time talking about changes. So hopefully it's something that you guys have implemented well and it's got a security element to it. So how do we ensure that a vulnerability that we discover is actually owned? For example, if a vulnerability exists that cannot be fixed, who is the owner of that vulnerability and is it tracked across the organization between different business units? So we have to ensure that when a vulnerability is discovered that cannot be fixed, there has to be some time frames associated with that. And hopefully that will allow us to fix the vulnerability in a more managed way. And this is an interesting one, my final point. I think everyone in this room has got some key performance indicators hanging around their necks, and I know I do. So one of the key factors and one of the big challenges we face with key performance indicators is, what happens to a key performance indicator when it crosses between different teams? Often there is no connection. A vulnerability, for example, might move from a development team to an operational team. It may start in a security team. So how do these processes get linked, and how do your management monitor the time that it's taking you? Because this is the key here. How long does it take anyone in this room to fix a critical vulnerability? And that's quite fundamental to the process that we're following for security compliance. Well, technical documentation. You need to ensure that elements of your applications are constantly being documented. And there are some fundamentally important components to consider. Firstly, data classification. Do you know the level of data sensitivity in your application? And also, very detailed and meaningful evidence. If you need to perform a compliance assessment, you require a lot of detailed information in order to do so. And also an authorization model and roles documentation. We find vulnerabilities time and time again that are related to missing authorizations. So this means that your team of developers and owners of the system need to monitor the authorization models and document them very clearly indeed. And of course, third-party components. You can see many examples of this. Equifax, the recent vulnerabilities that were found in the struts framework. If third-party components had been better managed, then Equifax would not have been compromised. And a lot of the vulnerabilities we see in web applications are all related to open source frameworks and components being reused. So again, like an inventory of applications, you need to have an inventory of all the frameworks that you are using in your organizations. This involves a lot of groundwork, And also you need to ensure that these are approved components. If somebody is going to be using a new open source tool from, or source code from somewhere like Apache Commons, you need to ensure that it's being utilized in a secure way and it's updated. When a vulnerability comes out in a third-party component, how do you manage that? And then, of course, as I mentioned, controlling code migration. So when a new third-party library vulnerability is released, how do you ensure that this is moved across to all your estate? Again, I use Equifax as a case study here. They had one application owner who decided that they didn't need the latest struts vulnerability to be patched. And we all know